Hello everyone, it's Dr. Young, and in this video I'm going to start introducing osmosis and diffusion. These two concepts seem to be confused by a lot of people and that they kind of switch them around or either try to think that they're the same thing. And I want to show you how they're really different fundamental processes. They both relate to concentration, but that's kind of where the similarities end. So let's talk about diffusion first, right? Diffusion is just the movement of a particle down its own concentration gradient, right? And so by particle, I mean really anything. So this particle can be, they can be ions, they can be molecules, right? It could be like a dye in water, it could be gas in a room, it could be kind of whatever you want. It's just anything, any particle. And when we say down its concentration gradient, what we're saying, right, its concentration gradient, we're just saying that it's going to move from high concentration to low concentration. All right, so high concentration to low concentration. And so I have this example down here. I like to use this example with my students because it's a pretty, it gets a reaction. But imagine you have a stink bomb, right? I have a stink bomb in the classroom. Really, really smelly. For those of you who are not familiar with stink bombs, little tiny capsules. Throw them on the ground, they break open, it smells real, real bad. And so, right, let's imagine initially, right, when I crash this stink bomb down to the floor, all those smelly molecules, right, are all in one little tiny area. They're all right wherever you crashed it, right? So I would be smelling the stink bomb, and if you were in this room with me, you were further away from me, you wouldn't smell it quite yet. Now, what we're saying by high concentration and low concentration, right, the idea is that this area where all of those smelly molecules are, this would be your area of high concentration. So that'd be a high concentration, so high conc. Versus over here where there's like none of the smell yet, right, no one's smelling anything, this would be low concentration. So low concentration. Now, what we're saying here, right, with diffusion, right, and you guys probably all know this intuitively if you've experienced things, right, you've smelled different things in your lives. You know that, right, over time, that smelly molecule is going to move its way through the room, right? You might not smell it at first, but you'll smell it eventually. And so that's what we mean by a particle is going to move down its concentration gradient, right? That these green particles, these smelly particles, are going to move from high to low, right? So at another time, at a future time, it may very well be that there are lots of those smelly molecules in that or part of the room, but they're going to have started to spread out, right? So we have areas of low concentration and high concentration still, right? So where this would be, again, still relatively high concentration, it might smell the worst over there, but then relatively low concentration over here. And then so it's still going to move down its concentration gradient, still spread out, still move through the room. And then eventually, right, the idea is that eventually there is no longer a high concentration area and a low concentration area. The idea is that the concentration is the same throughout, right? So over here, now we'd have the same concentration everywhere. So same concentration everywhere. Same concentration everywhere, right? And once you have that same concentration everywhere, that means diffusion stops, right? Diffusion only happens until the concentrations are equal. I just want to fix this concentration. That's about as good as it's going to get, I think. There we go. Whatever. So then, yeah, again, the idea here is that there's no more diffusion here. So no more diffusion, right? Because there's no longer a concentration gradient to move down, right? So diffusion is just that. It's the movement of a particle. It can be whatever. In this case, I picked a stinky gas, but it's when that particle moves down its concentration gradient. And by concentration gradient, we mean from high concentration to low concentration. That's what we're talking about. And the idea is that diffusion is important in a lot of biological. So for example, right, breathing, that's pretty important to us. If you look at how your lungs work, right, you breathe in air that's relatively rich in oxygen, low in CO2, and then your blood that is in your body in the alveoli, relatively low in oxygen and rich in CO2, relatively. So if I take a look at O2, for example, In your blood, the partial pressure of O2 is 40 millimeters per mercury, and in the lungs, it's 104 millimeters of mercury. Now, you don't need to be super familiar with those pressures or anything like that, but you can probably infer, right, that 104 is bigger than 40. So the idea is that you'd have more, right, you'd have more O2 in the air that's in your lungs than you have O2 that is in your blood. And so since there's more O2 outside in your lungs than inside your blood, we see O2 diffuse into your blood, right? Oxygen is going to diffuse in the alveoli into your bloodstream, into your plasma to get picked up by hemoglobin and then get pumped around your body. And then the opposite is true, right, in your lungs if you take a look at CO2, right? So if you look at CO2, that's at 40 millimeters millimeters of mercury in your lungs, but 45 millimeters of mercury in your blood. So that means there's actually more CO2, a little more CO2 in your blood than there is in the air that you're breathing. So again, CO2 is going to move down its concentration gradient and leave your blood and go into the air that you breathe. And then you breathe it out, get fresh air, and fill your lungs with now fresh air that again has a higher amount of O2 and a lower amount of CO2. So thanks to the fact that these gases move down their concentration gradients, we're able to, right, with every breath, pick more oxygen into our blood and release the CO2 out into the alveoli and breathe it out, right? And again, that's just diffusion. It's just particles moving down their concentration gradients. So for for oxygen, it's high in the lungs, low in the blood, so it moves into the blood. For CO2, it's high in the blood, but low in the air, so the CO2 moves out into the lungs, out into the air that's in your lungs. So important for your lungs. It's important for your kidneys, for your renal system, for example. There's a lot of concentration gradients with that. And then I also want to mention this in terms of the cell, right? A lot of people who are watching this video are taking some sort of health occupations chemistry class, or you're going to go and take A&P or cell bio or something like that. And I just want to mention this, right? There's lots and lots and lots of different types of particles inside your blood and outside your blood. So I picked three here. I picked sodium, potassium, and calcium. They're all ions. But there's also, chloride and bicarbonate and all proteins and all kinds of things. But what you can look at here is that this thing in black here, right? This is supposed to be your cell membrane. And the cell membrane is a semi-permeable membrane. Which just basically means that essentially only water can go through freely. Only water can pass freely. There are other molecules, small nonpolar ones that can go through a cell membrane, but that's really not for us to talk about right now. We just want to look at cell membranes as basically being a wall, right? Only water can pass through. In this case, sodium, potassium, and calcium cannot pass through is the idea. So if I look at my cell here, it looks like my concentration of sodium is 0.015 molar, so that's not a lot, versus outside the cell, it's 0.145 molar, right? It's 10 times more sodium outside the cell than inside the cell. So I'm going to use a big Na to represent a lot of sodium and a little Na to represent just a little sodium. So you want to ask yourself, how does sodium want to diffuse? Does sodium want to diffuse into the cell or out of the cell? And it turns out that these concentration gradients are really, really important for how cells kind of like get some energy. They use this potential energy, the fact that certain ions want to move into the cell or out of the cell, in order to do work, to either shuttle things up their concentration gradients or to generate energy to make ATP or all kinds of different things. So in this case, right, sodium wants to move down its concentration gradient, so sodium wants to move into the cell. Now, because like I just said, the cell membrane is semi-permeable, so it can't. It gets stuck here. It can't move into the cell unless it has some membrane membrane protein that allows it to. But sodium can't just freely move in there, so it's a little frustrated, but it wants to move into the cell, right? Sodium wants to move into the cell. Wants to diffuse into the cell, right? Because that's down its concentration gradient. If you look at potassium, we have the opposite thing here, right? Potassium is 0.140 and then only 0.005 molar on the outside. So if you look at potassium now, right? Potassium, there's a lot of potassium inside the cell, but very little potassium outside the cell. So potassium wants to move out. All right, so potassium wants to move out of the cell. And you guys will learn about sodium-potassium pumps and stuff and how these membranes are kind of set up. We're not going to talk about that here, but you will later. And then lastly, calcium, right? If we take a look at calcium, you should be able to look at these numbers and be like, well, I've got 10 to the negative 3 molar and I've got 10 to the negative 7 molar. 10 to the negative 3 is a lot bigger number because that's only 0.001 versus 10 to the negative 7 is 0.0000001, however many, 6 zeros and then a 1. So it looks like I have a lot more calcium on the outside than I do on the inside. So calcium wants to move in, wants to diffuse in. And again, these concentration gradients are going to be super important for when you start studying cell membranes and how they work. You'll talk about calcium-gated channels and action potentials and all kinds of things, things that, anyways, I won't get into it right now. But when we talk about diffusion, we're talking about the movement of any particle down its concentration gradient. That's all we're talking about. Sometimes there are membranes involved, sometimes there's not. It doesn't really need to have a membrane, right? Like my first example with that stinky gas. But that's all you need to know about diffusion is that it's a particle, it moves down its concentration gradient. So always high concentration to low concentration. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them down below. I recommend you do some worksheets and some reading. Happy studying.